Good afternoon. It's Wednesday, the 26th of November, just after 1 o'clock. Welcome to UK Column News. I'm your host, Mike Robinson. Joining me via live link are Charles Mallet and Vanessa Bailey. Later in the programme, we're going to be covering the fact that we're going to war unless it's stopped. We'll have news from Syria and UAE, and we'll have the latest on digital identity, and also the MHRA's response to the recent CDC announcement on vaccines. We'll begin today with the budget and the security lockdown, apparently, that's surrounding that, Charles.
Yeah, good afternoon, Mike. Good afternoon, all. Yes, an evolving situation, I think, would be the way to put it. And there are obviously a lot of things that are going to fall out of today's budget. A lot are already known. But the issue that we're going to concentrate on is the inheritance tax issue and farmers. Now, I'd like to point out that the BBC, who've been running wall-to-wall coverage of this issue for some time today, have not mentioned farmers at all. No great surprise there. But it does make it look like there is a political agenda at play in more ways than one. Now, just to recap on the issue at hand, in last year's budget, it was announced that the inheritance tax threshold would be amended in order that it would capture, in effect, a vast number of landowners and business owners who were previously unaffected. And part of the problem, this goes back to the initial change in 1992, but part of the problem is the lack of warning given, and that this is due to kick in April 2026, giving people very little time to plan around inheritance, the issues pertaining to inheritance tax, if they are to in some way avoid it. Now, farmers have been in discussion with the Metropolitan Police Service for a number of months about planning protests to coincide with the budget day today. And yesterday evening on X, the Met Police put out a tweet suggesting that the situation was beginning to change. Now, they've updated this further, but they're saying that there are suggestions that they've banned farmers protesting tomorrow, and that's not correct. But they have nonetheless taken it upon themselves to move the goalposts, and they've put up a policing operation update or a statement in which they say that conditions have been put in place to prevent protesters from bringing vehicles, including tractors or other agricultural vehicles, to the protest. Now, there are several issues that run alongside this, not least the fact that farmers did congregate in Westminster a year ago without incident, or certainly without any significant incident. Just as an aside, it is interesting to note, of course, that neither the congestion charge nor the ULEZ scheme are applicable to tractors or agricultural vehicles by being specialist vehicles. But there has been this 11th hour change, and indeed there's now, from police, a Section 14 Public Order Act 1986 being put into effect. Now, the police are saying that the decision was taken due to the serious disruption they may cause to the local area, including businesses, emergency services, and Londoners going about their day. Now, that would appear to be at a discrepancy or at odds with what has happened over the course of the last year since Rachel Reeves made this announcement last year. And obviously, as one can imagine, there is a certain amount of social media traffic coming out of the event now as to exactly what has been happening, whether there are arrests being made, which that does seem to be the case. But earlier this morning, John Lamont, MP for Berwickshire, Roxburgh and Selkirk, was on the ground, and he put this short video on Twitter.
We have hundreds, if not thousands, of farmers trying to come to Westminster to protest against Labour's family farm tax. And shockingly, the police, the Metropolitan Police, have banned these farmers from making their voices heard. Whitehall is completely shut down. All these tractors are piling up in and around Westminster. These farmers want to have their voices heard. They want to persuade the Labour government to think again. Now, at a time when there's all sorts of demonstrations taking place across London each week, it is extraordinary the Metropolitan Police and the government have made this decision. They are shutting down the voices of farmers, and they need to be heard. We need to stand with our farmers and try and get this family farm tax reversed.
Now, the the point that Lamont brings out there, really, or that needs to be explored, is the fact that this change was so last minute. So farmers have been committed to this, as well as a number of other supporters, either with or without vehicles. And the problem that the Metropolitan Police Service are creating is one of its own making, in that they are suggesting that people can only gather on foot by Richmond Terrace, just opposite Downing Street. Of course, what they will actually do, in effect, is create exactly the problem that they seek to put to one side by preventing tractors, because, of course, tractors are coming into London anyway. Where are they actually going to go? All of this is pointing very strongly towards the operational independence of police being seriously challenged, and that pertains to the very heart of protest itself. So, by interesting coincidence, just last month, the House of Commons put out a briefing paper on police powers, which we'll just bring up on screen now. And in particular, this deals with the legislation concerning control of this sort of event: the Public Order Act 1986, the Police Crime and Sentencing Courts Act 2022, and the Public Order Act 2023. But it's today, as I said earlier, the Public Order Act 1986, Section 14. And in effect, it's as though a police officer has taken the decision that there could be a risk of serious public disorder, damage to property, serious disruption to life, to the life of the community. Now, this is where we look ahead slightly to the Crime and Policing Bill, which, of course, we've talked about at some time, many times in the recent months, and in particular the offences that are coming concerning protests. When we consider that the scope of digital identity is broadening all the time, and indeed the use of facial recognition, live facial recognition. And of course, this bill plans to bring in the offences of concealing identity and the cumulative impact of disruption, very relevant to today, because of course, if the issue persists, so indeed might the protests. But this could constitute a cumulative disruption because it's being carried out on more than one occasion. Now, the farmers' position, in effect, is that if their demands are not met today, then they can cause big problems for the government by turning off the taps, in effect, with regard to the food supply. And it does look very much like the government has been planning around this eventuality. Now, food security in the United Kingdom is probably around 50% at best in terms of self-sufficiency. So it seems like no coincidence that the UK and the EU have struck a deal recently, which we'll just look at now. And that concerns effectively sort of greasing the skids with regards to trade going back and forth between the UK and the EU. And in effect, the same thing has happened in the United States. They say, for the EU, certainly, they say the aim of the agreement is to reduce the burden of trading agricultural products between the EU and the UK. As far as the United States is concerned, it was called the Economic Prosperity Deal, signed back in June. And that deals, in effect, with many of the same issues. Now, again, I think one point to make on the politicization of this issue is that whilst it appears the operational independence of police has been challenged, it's interesting to note the contrast between the outcry there was when Maccabi Tel Aviv fans were prohibited from coming to an Aston Villa football match, absolute outcry across not just the mainstream media, but also government, whereas now a legitimate section of British society is having its ability to protest seriously compromised, and yet not a single voice has come from either the mainstream media or the government to date to suggest that there's an issue here. Now, to find out more about the background to this, and indeed how the public can take direct action by dealing with farmers in order to make those vital economic connections, I point you towards the UK Column website, UK Farming Fighting for its Future. Of course, there'll be links to this in the show notes. And indeed to go to the farming section on the UK Column website, where there is a host of information about all the various issues that beset farmers. And indeed, Will Coleshill is on the ground, and we hope to be able to show a report from him during Extra.
Thank you, Charles. I think out of that, the bit that I find most hilarious is the Crime Policing Bill creates this offence of concealing identity, bearing in mind the requirement to do exactly that just a couple of years ago.
Well, absolutely, and in fact, not just that, but it's a crime anyway. The Crime and Disorder Act 1998 has exactly the same provision. So it's absolutely absurd in so many levels. But I mean, of course, you're completely right, and we just wait for the next health scare before that gets repealed or sort of scaled back or changed in some way.
Yes, indeed. Okay, well, look, at the beginning of the program, I suggested that we are going to war, and I'm going to explain why I'm saying that now. So here we have the Royal United Services Institute. They've just held their Long War Conference 2025 yesterday. Now, RUSI's military sciences team is launching a flagship program, Long War, they say, exploring how the UK and its allies can sustain conflict beyond the first battle. With the prospect of peer conflict on the horizon, this initiative asks how forces could be mobilised, reconstituted, and sustained across a protracted industrial scale war. So, Charles, Vanessa, we'll get comments from you, Charles, first of all. I mean, we're now talking about a protracted industrial scale war. This is language, invoking the First and Second World Wars here, and they are talking about this as if it's an inevitability.
They are, absolutely, and I think this has been the way that the language has been shifting over, well, at least a decade, if not more. And with as far as the British armed forces are concerned, with effectively the drop off of the operational commitments, particularly in Iraq and Afghanistan, there has been on one side of it the sort of scratching about and wondering what exactly the jobs will be in future. But of course, the other side of it is the defence or the war industry, and indeed what's been written into the Strategic Defence Review this year, predicated on this idea that Russia presents an existential threat, and therefore we need to mobilise, but via spending an enormous amount of money on lethal equipment with which to take on the mantle of this eternal war.
Well, we'll talk more about that in 1 second. Vanessa, just before I move on, have you got any thoughts on that point?
No, I find the language extremely disturbing and sort of odd, really, because we've throttled back in the UK on our military capability. So how on earth do they believe that they're going to be able to run an industrial scale war, unless, of course, just popped in my head, unless, of course, that war is not against other countries, but against its own population?
Well, let's see if we can answer one or two of these questions. So if we just pop that back on screen again, keynote speakers included General Sir Richard Barrons, who was the commander of Joint Forces Command from April 2013 until his retirement in April 2016. But he's much better known to UK column viewers and listeners as best buddy of Chris Donnelly, former NATO advisor who set up and ran the Integrity Initiative anti-Russia propaganda machine on behalf of the Foreign Office. And the other keynote speaker was Minister for Defence Readiness and Industry, Plymouth MP Luke Pollard. So let's just have a look at what Luke Pollard had to say here. So here he is. He said, "Thank you, RUSI, for convening this very timely discussion about preparing to fight a longer war. It goes right to the heart of the security challenges that we face." And he went on to speak about needing to punch and needing to be impatient and people to be driving new behaviors and new ways of working into deliverance. Maybe he just wants some banjo music or something. I don't know. But anyway, he went on to say, speaking about the development, he went on to speak about the development of Britain's military capability. He said it is a process that gets us to a new destination, because if we want to deter Russian aggression, we have to be ready to defeat it, because ultimately that is the way to create deterrence, the deterrence necessary to deliver peace. So this is the peace through strength mantra once again. Now, you might ask, well, how about talking to people? What happened to the Westphalian approach to international relations? The idea that acting for the benefit of the other might be the way to organize peace. But we've got to remember Tony Blair dealt with that, so that doesn't apply anymore. It's outdated. He went on to say, if you think about even a year ago, there was no UK-EU defence partnership. There was no UK leadership of the UK Defence Contact Group, no historic transit house agreements with Germany, no lighthouse projects that came to that trading house agreement, no reboots of the Lancaster House Treaty with France. And he said, to get to warfighting readiness, we need a whole of society approach. And so that's really what they're going for here. But what you're seeing on screen now is exactly what he's talking about, this EU UK agreement, or at least the basis of it, which are the various deals between Britain, Germany, France and Germany. So anyway, as I say, he went on to say we need a whole of society approach. We'll come on to this a little bit in a second, but before we do that, just to reinforce what Pollard was saying, here's a clip from the First Sea Lord, General Sir Gwyn Jenkins, speaking a couple of days ago at yet another war conference.
I genuinely believe war is a possibility. I really hope it doesn't come. It would be horrendous for all of us, for a bunch of reasons. But our professional job is to be ready. We owe it to our people to be ready, and we owe it to the nation to be ready, and any excuse is not good enough for doing our best to make sure that we're ready.
Quite incredible language. And I was speaking to Charles earlier before the news program. I was wondering if they're planning for perpetual war, what kind of war they're planning for. And Pollard has made it clear they're talking about a protracted industrial scale war. And as I say, that's World War I or World War II sort of level stuff. But the question is, are we really going to accept this strategic direction? Because if we are, it's not just Pollard and his colleagues who are clinically insane, perhaps, I would argue. But look, let's look at what we're dealing with here, because a few days ago, NATO held the Concept Development and Wargaming in NATO 2025 conference. They held it in Verona in Italy. And now the contraction of the name, by the way, is CD and WIN 2025. And they say that WIN has previously provided an opportunity for NATO senior leaders to gain hands-on experience with wargaming techniques and its use in NATO. Previous WIN events, they said, have successfully garnered support for the continued growth and use of wargaming in NATO. This year, WIN is focused on practitioners of wargaming so we can continue to grow, refine, and learn from one another, fostering improved wargaming in NATO. So let's just have a look at them playing with their toys from last year's conference.
This week, the Wargaming Initiative for NATO, or WIN24, takes place here in Hamburg at the Helmut Schmidt University. Over 300 attendees across 26 partner and allied nations will be immersing themselves in 21 war games at the tactical, strategic and political levels.
So this is Grand Ascent. It's a game that mimics how the North Atlantic Council makes decisions. If you play Ascent over time, you will learn how to make consensus more quickly and with greater quality. This is a game that was created by Allied Command Transformation to support the NATO headquarters.
Wargaming is an incredible and engaging method of analysis that allows us to engage a problem across multiple levels and often multiple levels of command.
The Wargaming Initiative has provided the participants with the opportunity to learn from each other, to strengthen our networks, and to promote security and stability across the world.
Now, I appreciate that people at home can't see Charles and Vanessa wetting themselves as that was playing. And, this is the clown show that we're looking at, Charles. But it's serious on one hand, because although they're having fun playing Risk or something similar, they're also wanting to steal billions of pounds and dollars and euros of taxpayers' money to fund the building of this military-industrial complex with a view to going to war with Russia and China.
I think there is a very serious side to it. I'm not quite sure how that naval chap kept a straight face while he was giving the commentary there. But no, I think that the serious point is that actually this, wargaming, the idea of wargaming, of asking the what if question is a very important one. And absolutely, it is done at all stages of planning in a military context. That is not new. However, to, in effect, infantilize it by playing actual board games, I think is a very deliberate step to remove the association with the lives that will be lost as a result of these sorts of things. In effect, it's down to the roll of a dice or something, completely banal. So I do think there is absolutely a very serious sort of background to the sweeping away of the consequences of doing this, and that seems to shine through in that, as well as the incorporation of civilians in order to make sure the message transmits beyond, the sort of the military environment.
Yes, indeed. And then finally, for this section, we go to France, where Macron has announced their conscription program, otherwise known as national service. Now, in preparation for the announcement, the French Army Chief of Staff, General Fabien Mandon, said this on Tuesday. We have the know-how and we have the economic and demographic strength to dissuade the regime in Moscow. I try not to laugh because this is where it gets serious, because he went on to say, what we're lacking, and this is where you, and he was speaking to mayors in France, this is where you have a role to play, is the spirit which accepts that we will have to suffer if we're to protect what we are. If our country wavers because it's not ready to lose its children or suffer economically because the priority has to be military production, then we are indeed at risk. You must speak of this in your towns and villages. And Vanessa, I would say that yes, people must speak about this in their towns and villages. There must be a blanket refusal to waste life on this insanity. And clearly there is a blanket refusal because, to a certain degree at least, because Macron's announcement stated that the new framework was meant to address what he called the desire for service amongst the youth. But, you know, the longer we go on, the more absolute insanity comes out of the mouths of these people.
Yeah, and absolutely. And of course, when they say we must be prepared to lose, they're not talking about themselves and their own families. They're talking about the conscripts and the poor military that are going to be poured out as cannon fodder, as of course they have been in Ukraine. Ukraine has set the example for this.
Let's move on then to the Ministry of Defence. And of course, they've been travelling right the way around the world over the last little while and spending lots of money on that. What have they been up to?
Well, yeah, I mean, it's good afternoon, everyone. I mean, the thing is, it's quite extraordinary to watch them playing their games of Battleship and so on. And as Charles said, it sort of distances them, just as we're seeing, of course, that war anyway is evolving into push-button mass murder rather than actual people on the ground that are going to suffer the consequences. But this was basically an article printed at Action Against Armed Violence. The UK MOD spent 110 million on travel in 170 countries in just 1 year, including to states beset by coups and repressive regimes. Of course, we won't talk about who those repressive regimes are and in relation to who, and also who's behind the various coups. But I was fascinated to see the countries that have actually been visited, bearing in mind we're supposedly heading for this industrial scale war, and yet the MOD seems to have forgotten that we're no longer an empire. They're visiting the vestiges of the empire, and as I said, spending taxpayers' money to do so. So let's have a look at the 15 destinations. They do include the US, Australia, Kenya, and Germany, but also Oman, Canada, Cyprus, Brunei, Nepal, Bahrain, Japan, Gibraltar, Norway, Saudi Arabia, Poland, and Singapore. And you can freeze frame and look at the actual cost of those visits. But then what is interesting, of course, guess what also happened is that MOD officials, something like 12 trips were made during the intensified genocide against Palestinians in Gaza. 299,000 pounds. Sorry, it's a little bit difficult to read now. It's gone small. Were spent basically in traveling to Israel, working on intelligence and defense cooperation since the beginning of the Gaza genocide. The cost of these journeys was not among the highest, but their timing is striking, of course, because they were ongoing during a genocide against the Palestinian people that, of course, is still running even now, despite the Trump peace scam. That included 623 surveillance flights, which I'll talk about a little bit later in this section, providing intelligence to Israel that is believed to have enabled the targeting of Palestinians inside Gaza. And as I mentioned, 12 trips were carried out by MOD officials during the actual ongoing genocide. Other countries visited, and I'd like to get Charles's and Mike's comments at the end of this section if we have time. So including China, Iran and Russia are up there. So I couldn't actually find details on the Russia and Iran trips, but China I did manage to. Afghanistan, Bangladesh, Iraq, Libya, Mali, Pakistan, Saudi Arabia, Colombia, Democratic Republic of Congo, Egypt, Ethiopia, Somalia, South Sudan, of course, that is undergoing also a genocide with British weapons by the Rapid Support Forces against civilians in Darfur, Sri Lanka, Turkmenistan, and Uzbekistan, Russian-speaking areas, of course. And then this is from The Spectator in April 2025 this year. Why did the British Defence Chief visit China? An interesting question. So Admiral Tony Radakan, who went to Beijing, he gave a speech to students of the People's Liberation Army at the National Defense University in Beijing. And as The Spectator says, take a moment to think about that. He also met with General Liu Zhenli, Chief of Staff of the Joint Staff of the Central Military Commission, the operational headquarters of the PLA. The Ministry of National Defense reported that the two sides conducted in-depth exchanges on China-UK relations and military-to-military relations, international and regional situations and issues of common concern, and had communications on strengthening exchanges and cooperation between the two militaries, which is, again, quite interesting, bearing in mind that we're supposed to be fearing Chinese surveillance in electric vehicles, as Charles reported last week. And then to finish off here, part of the in relation to the MOD heading to Israel on 12 trips during the genocide, the Foreign Office also flouted its own rules designed to stop MOD spy plane intelligence actually harming Palestinian civilians. And Ian Overton at Action Against Armed Violence points out that there have been no HR human rights assessments, ministerial approvals, or internal guidance regarding the intelligence sharing with Israel. And basically, when there is a sharing of intelligence between the UK and another country, it should trigger the Overseas Security and Justice Assistance Framework, which has not apparently been triggered according to FOIs that AOAV have put into the government. Mike, you'll be glad to know that they have received no response until very recently, when they were told that that information is not available. So, of course, the government has no accountability. The Ministry of Defense has zero accountability for actually participating in the genocide in Gaza. But I would love your comments on the fact that we appear to be visiting the countries that we're claiming are about to murder people in the streets of our cities, which are Iran, Russia, and China.
Before I comment on it, I'd like to hear Charles' thoughts on this, because what are the normal activities Ministry of Defence are pursuing in these types of trips?
It's a very good question. I mean, the sort of broader topic of defence engagement is kind of ongoing, and also don't forget that the one avenue, at least that would account for this to a certain extent, is the fact that every British High Commission or indeed British Embassy would have a defence section in it, and therefore that section would be liaising with the host nation armed forces, and that they would therefore be acting as a conduit of personnel to go to and fro. That doesn't explain the inconsistencies with regard to specifically Russia, China, Iran, and also Israel. And in fact, it's not exactly an aside, but I think directly relevant, I happen to know, because I spoke to the person in question, that astonishingly, even this summer, a defence attaché was appointed to Tel Aviv, a British defence attaché. That appointment was not actually in the end taken up, but it is quite staggering to think that even in the summer of 2025, exactly to Vanessa's point about what had happened, that appointment was still made.
How much of this type of travel is there to try to identify particularly in countries that Britain would like to see regime change, would be there to identify, as we've talked about with BBC Media Action in Syria, for example, identify people that are opposing forces and help develop relations with those people.
Yes, I'm not sure specifically that kind of issue would be entrusted with to military personnel. But of course, that insofar as obscuring the truth goes, let's say travel that's made by members of the intelligence services, which would be in fact shadowed by military personnel who would no doubt be accompanying, then that I think would explain some of the destinations. I mean, otherwise there are very many engagements with we've talked about already the apparent idea of the defence dividend. Of course, part of the big sales push is for European nations and indeed the British to start spending more and more and more on defence, but actually a huge part of it is what we can flog to other countries, which is why this idea of defence engagement is so important, is what are we going to be able to sell, albeit, as you say, predicated on the threat of such and such a thing happening.
Yes, indeed. Well, anyway, let's come to you then and continue this theme. And I think we're going to begin with defence intelligence, if that's not an oxymoron.
Well, it can be sometimes. And I think this is a very interesting case of sort of pot and kettle. This was put out by the Ministry of Defence yesterday and begins with the usual refrain of referring to Russia's illegal full-scale invasion of Ukraine. But the eye-catching bit was at the bottom of the update, which says, since launching the illegal full-scale invasion of Ukraine in 2022, the Russian state has increasingly sought to control, censor, and constrict its domestic information environment. And that struck me as being outstandingly hypocritical. The most obvious point of reference, I would think, is to look at Ofcom from 2022 and the action that they took against the Russia Today network. And the way they put it was that RT is no longer broadcasting in the UK. On the 18th of March 2022, Ofcom revoked RT's broadcast license on the basis that we did not consider RT's license fit and proper to hold it. Licensee, ANO TV Novosti, fit and proper to hold it. Now, the critical part, in a way, as we've just been alluding to any war and indeed the build-up to it, is the information that passes to and fro. And just to go further on this, there's a press release put out by the Ministry of Defence just today, I think it was, saying that the UK has smashed a Russian cybercrime network responsible for attacks on UK businesses, effectively boasting about imposing sanctions on criminals. And if the Russian state architecture doesn't care about sanctions, I'm not sure I can really see that Russian cyber criminals will pay much heed to it. But nonetheless, the MOD persists in saying that the Foreign Secretary has announced a crackdown on illicit cyber activity globally as cyber attacks cost the UK economy $14.7 billion. Well, we'll return to that, I think, later in the programme. The Ministry of Defence carry on. And again, on this point of information and indeed this threat and the idea of there being a long war, of course, I know Mike has spoken about this in the past, but this, the sort of Russian threat in the North Atlantic. Now, the reason I'm referring to all of this is because it does fit in with what Soldier magazine has been writing about this month, and that is a piece entitled "Taking Aim at Unknown Drones." Now, there's been some background to this, but effectively the article is suggesting that through a new armed forces bill, military personnel are going to be given powers to relate to the threat of drone strikes within the UK. They say the intruders can only be shot down in so-called extreme circumstances, such as where there is an obvious threat to life and in some other defined situations under current law. So it's all rather vague. It's been taken up by Unmanned Airspace, a trade publication, which says that John Healey's announced the new counter-drone legislation and support for allies. But the point of this is that the legislation that's being proposed in the as yet unseen Armed Forces Bill only relates to the apparent threat to the military and not to civilians. So whilst we're on the one hand supposed to engender a whole of society approach to war, not apparently if there's a civilian threat, or at least a threat to civilians from drones, which seems to be extremely inconsistent. And of course, the other point, which I have made several times before, is to refer to this idea of how on earth is one supposed to know what is a threat and what is not. We look at Darlington in the north of England, which has been selected by Amazon as the location for their drone fleet for prime air drone delivery. And of course, the Civil Aviation Authority being completely inconsistent there on what may or may not be done with regard to drones, depending on whether you're an individual or a gigantic corporation. And I'll just go back to Soldier magazine to point out that notwithstanding all the activity surrounding Palestine Action at the moment and what's going through the courts, Elbit Systems is still advertising in Soldier magazine. And of course, you can see unmanned aerial vehicles on the bottom right if you are watching the screen. And I just wind up by referring back to what Mike was speaking about last week, which was the seminar held by the IDF, which there was confusion as to whether British personnel had attended or not. Now, I've been in touch with the IDF press office to try and ascertain whether or not they think that there were any Brits there. And they sent me through a packet of photographs, which of course I've scanned. I haven't seen any British looking combats, but if we just put that image back on screen now, what you will see, and indeed it's very public, but just I think worth noting that the Americans were represented in numbers at this seminar, specifically based on what they're describing as lessons from the war. And so just with that in mind, I'll just finish with a quote that I was sent from the Commander Ground Forces, Major General Nadav Lotan, who says, "I was moved to see all of you come to learn from the IDF. This seminar allowed us not only to present what we have learned, but also to learn from you." Now, the reason I show that is not just to consider that in its own right and the attendance of the Americans and many other nations who the United Kingdom is supposedly allied with, but also to ask the question, where does that leave the UK if in effect they didn't acknowledge the invitation, they didn't attend, but they are of course still aligned with all of the other nations that did go, but apparently not actually part of the process itself.
Yes, thank you, Charles. Thank you for that. Okay, let's move on. If you like what the UK column does, we do need your ongoing financial support. If you can possibly support us financially, please do have a look on the front page of the UK column website. You'll find a link that explains what you can do to help. That would very much be appreciated. Now, just to let you know that although the weekly banter went out yesterday, and that's now on the UK column website, in fact we can't bring a germ warfare tonight because of technical issues, germs having problems in South Africa, so there'll be no germ tonight. But if you haven't seen the weekly banter from last night, please do have a look at that. Carl Zad tonight is going to be talking to Arnaud Bertrand about Europe's strategic failures. And tomorrow at 1 p.m, Sandy Adams is speaking about escaping the matrix and I guess not supporting the British government in its war plans at the moment. So join us at 1 p.m. for that. A quick reminder that on Saturday this week at Beaches Green in Stroud, Ben Rubin and Sandy Adams will be speaking alongside Dr. Mike Eden. Details on screen, also in the show notes. So do get along to that if you possibly can. It's cash on the door only, however, so please do go if you're in the area. Now let's move on because the BBC and others are reporting the existence of an internal government briefing produced by the Ministry of Justice. So here's the article here. Justice Secretary wants jury trials scrapped except in most serious cases. So this briefing note has apparently gone to all other Whitehall departments. And the BBC reports that it confirms plans to create a new tier of juryless courts in England and Wales. And they say that the document proposes only guaranteeing juries for defendants facing rape, murder, manslaughter, or other cases passing a public interest test. Now, the BBC says that David Lammy wants to ask Parliament to end jury trials for defendants who would be jailed for up to 5 years. And that these proposals are an attempt to end unprecedented delays and backlogs in the courts. and do not apply to Northern Ireland or Scotland. Well, that's because Northern Ireland already has no jury trials because of historic issues with the so-called Troubles. But nonetheless, here what we're saying is problem, reaction, solution, because this problem was created by successive governments, and the idea of removing juries has been one that's been proposed by successive governments. So if you want shorter waiting lists for trials, then perhaps reduce the number of the people in the country or build infrastructure necessary to support the increased population. But this is not about the inefficiencies, the alleged inefficiencies in the process or with juries. Juries have been a target because of their power to overturn bad law, and we're seeing so much bad law being created by the British regime. I suspect that they see juries as a major threat. But in the longer term, another potential reason is that in the not too distant future, we'll see an increase in the use of AI in the so-called justice system. We need to make room for that. And to be clear, this is purely academic at the moment. There's a clear drive to use AI for scheduling and a host of admin tasks like document processing. But the idea of AI making judicial decisions is being discussed. But as usual, I suspect we're at the top of a slippery slope. Charles, what are your thoughts on this?
Well, I think it would be an absolute disaster in every respect. But the problem is that everybody seems very willing to go for it, albeit a totally untried, untested mechanism. It's already being used by the police. It's already being used by the prison service, the probation service, and the government has been writing about using it in justice. And indeed, one has heard reports from judges themselves saying that they've already used AI in helping them with their summing up. So, it is a huge danger, not just because it pushes us away from juryless trials, which is, of course, terrifically significant, but also because there seems to be a complete misunderstanding or at least a total lack of information or knowledge about the biases that are inherent within AI. So, I mean, a huge number of problems associated with going down this route, but this is exactly what is being pushed by Leveson with his review of earlier in the year and all the rest of it. But like everything else, it's explained very well. We're just short of time. It's the most convenient thing to do.
We should not understate the importance of juries and jury nullification and the idea that a jury can overturn bad law. This is something that juries are almost never told about, but it is a key role.
It is. It's absolutely a key role. I mean, with that, we have to be mindful of the fact that it absolutely works both ways, in effect, in that sometimes we will look at the way in which a jury has taken that action and think that is a sort of a right and proper outcome, and sometimes possibly not. And there have been a number of high-profile incidents relating to sort of climate and slavery-associated issues where the jury did exactly exercise that power. And of course, there was outcry afterwards because it was, deemed by many people that was the wrong outcome. But nonetheless, giving the jury the chance to deliberate it should be absolutely sacrosanct.
Yes. Okay. Thank you for that. Let's move to the Middle East again, then, and Vanessa, Syria and protests beginning on the streets. Are we starting to see 2011 again?
No, I think we're starting to see a pushback against the atrocities committed by the collective West imposed Takfiri regime. And I just wanted to remind everyone, because we've basically been predicting these protests for some time in the articles that are being published at Syria Centric, which is the section not only on Syria, but regional analysis, going as far as the Sudan, with a recent article by Marwa Osman. And we are basically trying to bring on board authors from the region. And I did just want to point out, because someone mentioned, I think, on the YouTube channel, that all the articles appear to be written by me. They are written by me, but in collaboration with Syrians still inside Syria, whose names obviously can't be revealed for security reasons. So this is just a few seconds of a video of the protests in the coastal region in Syria yesterday. So if we just play that. And then on social media, a number of very well-known Syrian or Syrian sympathetic accounts went on record basically saying that what is unfolding in Syria is a reaction against what has been going on since December last year. It's almost a year since the fall of Damascus on December the 8th, 2024. 5 people were killed once the General Security, as it's called, the militia that are working with the Jilani regime waded in and basically started injuring and using live ammunition against the protesters. So 5 dead and a number of injuries. But the protests have continued, 42 protests across basically the coastal area in central Syria. They haven't arrived at Damascus yet. But this is another account that I would recommend everyone follow, Syria Justice Archive, that basically runs an archive of all of the atrocities being committed by Jilani's forces. And again, they talk about the protests among the Alawites, Christians, and Ismailis. Now, it's interesting that the Ismailis, another minority sect in Syria, have joined the protest because until now, they have been relatively left alone by Jilani. They were among the first to surrender as the Takfiri forces were advancing towards Damascus. The fact that they're now joining the protests is, for me, a sign that there is a general unrest that is now bubbling to the surface, or rather boiling to the surface. Now, of course, the threat will be federalism, and whether Western nations that were involved in the regime change war, not necessarily Western, Israel, Turkey, Russia, will exploit the protests to basically take control and partition Syria into sectarian statelets, which of course was the project of Israel with the Clean Break Doctrine published in 1996. But just a quick look at the map to see where the protests are actually taking place so people can sort of geolocate it a little bit. So Latakia, Tartus, Hama, Homs, which is in central Syria, you can see there, close to the border with Idlib and in Hama. So serious protests going on, and something, as I said, that we've been predicting for some time in the articles that have been published up at UK Column. So not a huge surprise, but we have to wait and see where they go. Now, will Damascus join in the protests? Personally, I think there's a very strong possibility because there has been an ethnic cleansing campaign being run by the Takfiri forces. If we can just have a look at the post on X by Syria Justice Archive, showing that the Takfiris are now building a sectarian apartheid-style wall in one of the areas in Damascus, in Al-Samaria area, which has been under attack in the last few weeks, with families being persecuted and basically pushed out of their homes, and Takfiri elements being resettled into those homes. But now, effectively, what they appear to be doing is to be building a wall around the area to be able to fully besiege the Alawite communities within that area. So I think pretty soon we are going to see unification of those protests. But I also wanted to draw people's attention to a 2012 email among the Hillary Clinton emails released by WikiLeaks, which actually stated, so this was 2012, at the same time, the fall of the House of Assad could well ignite a sectarian war between the Shiites and the majority of the Sunnis of the region, drawing in Iran, which in the view of the Israeli commanders would not be a bad thing for Israel and its Western allies. In the opinion of this individual, such a scenario would distract and might obstruct Iran from its nuclear activities for a good deal of time. In addition, certain senior Israeli intelligence analysts believe that this turn of events may even prove to be a factor in the eventual fall of the current government of Iran. So, as I said, while these protests seem to be organic at the moment, one doesn't know how they might be infiltrated and exploited in favor, of course, of the Zionist bloc in the region.
Okay, thank you, Vanessa. Charles, let's come back to you then. And well, as company directors, many people have had to register their identification with Companies House recently. What's the latest on this?
Well, the latest really is the pushing of a false narrative, I would say, by Companies House, which of course goes back to the Economic Crime and Corporate Transparency Act 2023. Effectively, the suggestion that Companies House is being used as a front for what they're calling bogus directors. So they're saying that these changes, in order that they avoid these sort of bogus circumstances. And again, this is something that's been pushed very much on social media over the last couple of years, with much reporting on how Companies House is kind of complicit in an awful lot of fraud and other crime. But they have put out a mechanism by which one is supposed to confirm or verify one's identity if indeed you are a company director or a person with significant control of an organization. Now, a lot of this has been confusingly reported, let's say, or willfully misreported. There's been a lot of information out there about the requirement for biometrics and all that kind of thing. Now, that's not necessarily the case, whilst it is possible to go that particular route. And on screen now is a video that's been put out by Companies House as to how you might verify your identity, and of course the security and convenience of doing so. It is really about pushing people towards a centralized government-run digital identity. And when I say government-run, they might control it insofar as the purchasing and design and organisation goes, but of course this is all held by third parties. Now, I've been in touch with the Companies House press office to get an update on exactly what has been going on, and to ask questions about their sort of reporting on the way they see it. Now, they say that they're phasing in the identity verification over 12 months from the 18th of November to make things easier for existing directors. Now, anybody who has acted as a company director will have to scratch their heads now and think of all those difficulties that have been put before them because Companies House apparently didn't know who they were. Anyway, they went on to say that they've designed our identity verification processes to be simple, secure, and robust. Well, we'll come back to that in a minute. They say that more than 1.7 million individuals have successfully verified their identity. This is going back to the deadline, or what they were very much suggesting was a deadline of the 18th of November, and that there are still 6 or 7 million people who are still required to do so. They then said, and I would like Mike's comment on this, that the verification and filing services were unaffected by the Cloudflare issues as reported on the 18th of November. Mike, what's your take on that?
I would be highly skeptical of that. We can talk much more about this in extra, but I have absolute reason to believe that Companies House was affected by the Cloudflare outage. Well, as I say, we'll talk about that in extra.
Yeah, it's absolutely an interesting talking point. Nonetheless, they went on and have been moving the goalposts on their website about verifying your identity. The first thing they said was just the day before what they'd absolutely suggested was a deadline. They put out an update saying that this date is not a deadline, but it marks the start of a 12-month transition period, in effect giving themselves wiggle room for the number of people that do not appear to have actually complied and signed up. And then, somewhat ironically, they then have a fraud warning saying, do not let others use your identity. And to my point about the government not actually controlling this, of course, this is all entirely contingent upon the management of your data by Experian, who, again, further irony, have on their website a data breach resolution service. Now, if you're wondering why that's ironic, we'll go back to 2015 and look at the Twingate report, a massive UK data breach that Experian were responsible for, or indeed suffered, largely due to, involving mobile telephone operators. Then another in South Africa in 2020, affecting 24 million people in South Africa. And more recently, the Dutch DPA have fined Experian 2.7 million for breaches of GDPR. So I think it would be something of a stretch to suggest that that data is in safe hands. And if you're not a company director or you have nothing to do with Companies House, then may I suggest that this is the thin end of the wedge. And if at first they came for the company directors, they will absolutely eventually come to you. Of course, the way to subvert, thwart, and bog down this system is via freedom of information requests, and in particular subject access requests, in order to find out the information that they do have on you in order to be able to get that information removed. I would just finish off by encouraging you to go to the UK Column website and type in a search for digital identity. It's a little bit small on the screen, but there is absolute trove of information about this, about where it's going, where it's come from, and how it will affect you.
And just to add to this, I just want to put a smile on everyone's face, because here is Richard Dearlove, who is extremely concerned all of a sudden that when you aggregate data into one massive database, he means, of course, it immediately becomes a target for the country's enemies. You therefore must be sure that the citadel is impregnable. He's talking about the citadel that is the massive database. Well, it's interesting that he focuses on the country's enemies, and when in fact most of these data breaches are related to criminals and criminal gangs. But anyway, we'll talk more about that and extra as well. But Vanessa, let's come back to you and back to the Middle East again. And what are the UAE and Israel up to?
Yeah, and also quite amusing that, of course, most of the data is being stored on Israeli cloud systems. But anyway, minor detail. Basically, we have a situation, of course, in Gaza, unsurprisingly, even with the UN Security Council Trump resolution. Of course, it's basically frozen, with Israel still occupying 58% of Gaza's territory and still bombing and starving and basically ethnically cleansing the Palestinians that remain in a much reduced territorial area of Gaza. At the same time, we've talked about this often, that where are we heading towards? And as you always say, Mike, follow the direction of travel. Don't look at the distractions on the way. And this is very much what the UAE has been quietly up to, why the genocide has been ongoing in Gaza. UAE and Israel quietly advanced this so-called peace railway amid the Gaza genocide. Now, what is this? Of course, the UAE, this is a tweet, or rather a post, I still can't call them posts, back in 2024, when the UAE and Saudi Arabia were effectively providing a land bridge to allow the supply to basic supplies to break the Yemeni Red Sea blockade, of course, to try and bring an end to the genocide in Gaza. And how does this tie in with the long-term plans and campaign by Israel and, of course, by Trump and the UK, the entire alliance, including Tony Blair, of course? If we have a look at this, it's the India, Middle East, European Economic Corridor, the blessings and curse map that Netanyahu showed at the UNGA. And you can see quite clearly they're going from India through the UAE, Saudi Arabia, using Palestinian territory, Palestinian gas, of course, to create the free trade zone in Gaza, linking into Greece, bypassing Cyprus there. But of course, Israel is stealth occupying Cyprus with the help of the Greek Cypriot government. So basically what we're looking at and what we have to keep an eye on is this end-term plan by the collective West, the GCC, the Gulf state countries that, of course, are captured by the Zionist bloc, Tony Blair and Jared Kushner and so on, and see everything that is occurring in the region as being very much part of this.
Thank you, Vanessa. Thank you. We're going to end today with a little bit of vaccine news. So 6 days ago, the Center for Disease Control in the United States published this page on their website. And the first key point states that the claim vaccines do not cause autism is not an evidence-based claim, because studies have not ruled out the possibility that infant vaccines cause autism. And they go on to say that HHS has launched a comprehensive assessment of the causes of autism, including investigations on plausible biologic mechanisms and potential causal risks. And they say that the webpage shall be updated with gold standard science results from the HHS comprehensive assessment from the causes of autism as required by the Data Quality Act. Well, that posting has garnered quite a response from the MHRA here in the UK. They're clearly very upset about it. Here's Dr. Alison Cave, the MHRA safety officer. She says, multiple large, well-conducted studies involving millions of children worldwide have consistently demonstrated that there's no evidence that vaccines cause autism in children. She went on to say vaccination remains one of the most effective and safest ways, there you have it, to protect against serious and potentially life-threatening diseases, supported by decades of scientific evidence in the UK and internationally. But don't worry, because patient safety is her top priority. The MHRA encourages anyone to report suspected side effects to them via the MHRA yellow card scheme. Charles, how well did that work during the COVIDocracy?
I can't really imagine it going any worse, frankly. And I mean, even now, I think 5 years on, the number of people that actually are aware that there was a yellow card scheme, I think is still absolutely minuscule.
Yes, but clearly they're very upset with what Robert Kennedy's doing. Well, we'll keep everybody posted on how that develops. But we got to leave it there for today. So I'm going to say thank you very much, Charles and Vanessa, for joining me. Thank you all for watching. If you're a UK Column member, please do stick around on the live stream, and we'll be back for some UK Column News Extra in a few minutes. Otherwise, don't forget Carl tonight and interview tomorrow, Sandy's interview tomorrow at 1 o'clock. We'll be back on Friday at 1 p.m. as usual for another news programme. See you then.